We're live in Washington, D.C. this morning. The Senate's going to be holding a hearing to investigate the planned $85 billion marriage between AT&T and Time Warner today. The CEOs of both companies are going to be testifying. According to some prepared text, Time Warner CEO Jeff Bewkes will argue that the deal will allow his company to continue innovating content by adding more interactive features to video products. Joining us right now to talk about this, Utah Senator Mike Lee. He's the chair of the subcommittee on antitrust, competition policy, and consumer rights, and he's going to be presiding over that hearing later this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what are you looking to hear specifically?
As with any antitrust issue, any proposed merger, my hearing is going to be focusing on what this will do to competition. We want to look at how a particular transaction will affect competition and not necessarily how it will affect any particular competitor. In other words, our inquiry relates to consumer welfare. What effect, if any, is this going to have on pricing and how that's going to affect the consumer?
So people talk about zero rating, the idea that if you put both of these things together, that AT&T might be able to offer a product that allows a consumer of that product to stream HBO without it counting against your the equivalent of minutes or the amount of data going over the pipe. Is that something that you would think is fair, unfair?
Well, yeah. I mean, anytime you can have two companies coming together to offer a new service, possibly untethering people from traditional connections, that's something to be taken into account. If they're going to be able to offer something that hasn't previously been offered or to offer it at a lower price, that could tend to suggest that this would be good for consumer welfare. Right. There are other risks as well. There are risks that we have to take into account.
Philosophically, where are you on net neutrality? Because that actually is an issue that sort of underlies this transaction to some degree.
Sure. Philosophically, I think these things should be determined by the market and not by government regulators. I don't think we ought to have federal agencies stepping in and saying, we, the almighty regulator, are going to decide this.
But from a competitive standpoint, you know, Netflix has said, look, if you have a zero rating for HBO, you got to give us the zero rating. Whatever it is, it should be the same across the board for all content providers. Are you in the same place on that?
Sure, I understand that argument.
Right.
My point is just that it ought to be the free market that decides that and not a government regulator telling people how that ought to operate.
Now, you don't have oversight per se of this particular transaction.
Correct.
And the other question then is, who do you think will and should? There's a question of whether the FCC actually will be able to touch this, depending on how this deal is considered because of some of the assets that Time Warner owns.
Yeah, that's right. And the regulatory bodies at issue are going to have to decide that between themselves. We don't get to decide that. I'm interested to see where it goes. I'm most interested for today's purposes, though, to see what this does for competition and to see what they can answer in terms of the questions we have about what this will do to consumer.
What did you think of Donald Trump's comments on the campaign trail?
With regard to this
transaction, where he said that he wouldn't allow it to go through. There's been some reports since then that since he's been elected, at least privately, that there may have been indications that they might have more of an open mind about this deal.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think he also raised some concerns that are legitimate, that are held by a number of people, suggesting a lot of people worry that you give too much power to any one media entity. What's that going to do? Are they going to lock certain people out of access to Time Warner content? Are they going to raise prices for access to Time Warner content to the point that they would drive out competition in that space? Those are legitimate questions, and I think they need answers.